She was previously the building official and fire marshal for the city of St. Helena in Napa Valley. And Cindy has also served as the chair of the California Building Officials Historic Codes Committee. She has served as the commissioner on the California Building Officials Training Institute from 2002 to 2005. But needless to say, she has a lot of knowledge and experience disseminating that knowledge. So please welcome Cindy.
Thank you, Helen. So John gets ready here. This is a little bit of a departure from what I'm used to talking about because normally in my previous life as a building official, I taught courses for California building officials, to building officials, on the use of the State Historical Building Code. So we took it chapter and verse, went through it, showed examples. Then a few years ago, after I took this job, I was invited to speak at a conference in Colorado. And couldn't really talk about the California Historical Building Code, but I began to think about what is kind of a universal approach to preserving historic buildings and using or applying building codes. As you probably, if you're involved in construction, you know that the codes that are in effect now are the international codes that are adopted by the states and modified. California's code is the California, it's called the CBC. So there's some commonality in the codes throughout the country and actually internationally. So, but not every state has a historical building code. And California, I believe, is unique in that. And so when I started thinking about this, I wanted to think about the kind of what is the process, what makes for a successful project from a building official's perspective. Because I thought about the preservationists that I was addressing in Colorado, but I thought what was really important was to talk about this from a building official's perspective and what you must bring to the table, what's involved in getting a successful project. Okay. There we go. There we go. Okay, so these are just some of the things that I thought about, and we'll kind of follow a train of thought here in my presentation, and then I'll show you some examples on some simple projects, simple applications, the type of thing that as a building official I had to deal with more commonly, guardrails, windows, door openings, accessibility, things that were maybe you weren't looking at it in a broad menu of applications, but there were very specific elements of a building that were important. There were important features, and how did we deal with that? So I want to talk about what are some of the common assumptions that people bring to the table when they're talking about historic buildings. Understanding the scope, use, intent, and purpose of the code is extremely important. And are we speaking the same language? Because we're not. As preservationists, or put another way, as building officials, we don't deal with a lot of the terms that are addressed in the State Historical Building Code. They're not part of the vocabulary. So there's a bit of a learning curve there, and I think a little different approach when you're looking at applying the code and what it is that you're trying to achieve, which is part of understanding the intent of the code. And then I'm going to follow up with some case studies, again, as I said, to show you some examples of how that was, some solutions were achieved, and some of the thought processes that went into that. So some of the common assumptions, and I'm very pleased to say that some of these no longer exist. I think people are getting it in California. But from a building official's perspective, a common assumption is, let me step back for a moment. I taught this class for many years to building officials. So I heard this a lot, but I've been out of it for a while. So keep that in mind. But I'm telling you what I still think, or I still hold to be kind of a common approach in getting successful projects. But one of the common assumptions from a building official is that if you change the building or you alter it, you have to meet current codes. If you're changing the use, you have to meet the current codes. And remember, it is up to the applicant to ask to use the code. If you don't ask, don't expect the building official to stand there and to offer you alternatives. That is your responsibility, not the building officials. And on the other hand, I've heard preservationists come in and say, well, it's a historic building, therefore I don't have to, you fill in the blank. I don't have to make it accessible because it's existing. I don't have to change the guardrails because they were there. There's certain things I don't have to do. Now, I'm not hearing that so much anymore. From where I sit, I get phone calls from people that are dealing with building departments. And again, I think the work that California Preservation Foundation and California building officials are doing is really raising the awareness and providing people with resources and how to deal with historic buildings. It's important to understand the intent of the code, the State Historical Building Code, and it does not relinquish its responsibility in ensuring minimum standards to achieve health, safety, and general welfare, or protect people. That is its premise, and it really doesn't tolerate a lesser standard. These are just alternatives to achieve the same standard, and that is really what is inherent in the performance nature of the code, is to protect the historic elements, features, fabric, integrity of a building, while meeting an acceptable, reasonable level of safety. So the code provides for these things, and as Alan pointed out, it provides for provides regulations for the preservation, restoration, rehabilitation, relocation, or reconstruction of qualified historical buildings. It's applicable for all issues regarding building code compliance for qualified historical buildings, and it's used in conjunction with the regular code. And again, last point, very important point, is that property owners must ask for the use of it. And the role of the building official is to enforce the provisions of the code, to render interpretations of code, not just historic building code, but all codes, and to adopt policies and procedures to clarify the application of the code. Again, with the intent and purpose, or within the intent and purpose of the code. The code does provide alternative solutions for the preservation of historic buildings, qualified historic buildings. I'll show you some examples of those as we've touched upon it in conversations here. It also requires access for persons with disabilities, and that will be going into that in the afternoon. And it provides for a reasonable level of safety, and it is also a cost-effective approach to preservation. And when I talk to building officials, I point this out because you won't find in the text of codes this language. This is intended to be a cost-effective approach because in many times, if you mandate compliance with the regular code, you are going to destroy the building, you can destroy those features that make it historic, and you can add needless cost to a project. So the process for applying the code is to first understand the use, the scope, and proposed changes to the building. And I must say that in all the projects that I have dealt with in 21 years of code enforcement, the most successful projects are those where you did approach this as a team. And Terry was spot on, is that this is a team, and the building department and your planning department, fire department are part of the team, and they need to be brought into this. The most successful projects I have ever dealt with were when the applicant came in before the project was started, before plans were submitted, and we talked. We had a conversation about what the applicant wanted to do. They talked about the challenges, and we began to identify some possible solutions. And it was a process that took time, but it involves that conversation. You have to come in and talk to people. Again, it is the applicant's responsibility to use the code, and in many times it's the applicant's responsibility to provide that documentation, and the building official can require documentation. So we need to understand what the scope, what the use of the project is. You need to understand the specific requirements that one is seeking relief from, because it's important. You need to identify the alternatives. Again, the owner will request use of the code and will identify alternatives. The building official is required to consider reasonable alternatives. So, you know, you have recourse, or a property owner has recourse if a building department or a fire department or someone is requiring um, is not considering those alternatives, and that's the State Historic Building Safety Board, the consultation and appeal process. And the building official can require documentation. And I would say, kind of anecdotally, as a building official, former building official, it is always a good idea to document any alternative to the regular code. Anything that you are looking for, alternative that you want to apply, it is always a good idea to document, because these become part of the record, and years down the road, people can come in, want to know why something was done. You have a record of it, and that's just good practice. Um, Alternative to the code are used in conjunction with the regular code. I can tell you that rarely did I see, in fact, I can't think ever, did a building owner come in or an architect come in and want to use the code very broadly, the State Historic Building Code very broadly. They're usually looking for a certain aspect where they just couldn't make it work, so they wanted to use some alternatives. And I have a number of examples I'll show you. And again, alternatives are typically used on or accepted, reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Now, when I talk about the language, this is stuff building officials don't deal with. We don't talk about historic fabric when we're talking about applying a code, the California Building Code, California Plumbing Code, electrical, so forth. This is not part of the vernacular. Character defining features, integrity, secondary interior standards, adaptive reuse. These are terms that are part of the preservation vocabulary, but not part of a building department vocabulary. So we need to, it's important that when we approach this, we are talking about this and we are identifying what is historic fabric, what are character defining features, because many of the alternatives that you apply really ride on this. That character, fabric, integrity is going to be damaged because due to the application of the regular code. So some examples of qualified historical buildings, the code details those, properties on the National Register, California Register, local inventory, state of points of historical interest, and so forth. The one that I think that encompasses more building stock are the local inventories and surveys. But I think it's important to note that these must be officially accepted. So there's some latitude there. But the way I looked at it when I was working in this is that I wanted to see that a government body had recognized this property as having historic significance. So just some examples of buildings that are on the National Register. You see the very iconic buildings, but there are also some lesser buildings that could be listed on the National Register. What is very important as someone from a code working as a building official, planning, fire, is to know what your resources are. Again, these are processes and steps that aren't part of our typical activity. A building official doesn't necessarily have a book of all the properties that are listed in the survey or on the National Register. So it's important to ask these questions or to provide that information to them. So just an example of a district and a nomination. Again, I'm using a lot of images from the Napa Valley where I worked and lived for a long time. The National Register nomination forms contain a lot of information, and for individual buildings will and can identify those character defining features. And this is very important. If you're going in and, for instance, asking to rebuild a porch or to repair something or whatever element, if it's contained in here, you have documentation that this is a significant feature of the building that is worth protecting. And it's important to have that in hand when you're talking to someone in your building department or fire department asking for use of the code. Some examples of buildings that are listed on the National Register or structures. Again, these are from St. Helena, but we created a National Register district there that encumbered a number of buildings and some that people would never think would be listed on the National Register. The old sheet metal barn, the election leaders, the light standards, little gas stations. These are all building types that would qualify for use of the State Historical Building Code. So again, it's very important to ask or to present that information. Don't assume that they know. Just an example of a survey. So buildings included in the survey would qualify for use of the code. State DPR forms. It's an older form, but here's a property that had was on the California Register. Again, it contains useful information, and many times they contain photographs, historic photographs, some information that can reveal, information, and possibly you can present it to the building department as proof of a condition that you may be wanting to either restore or protect. This is an example of a building within St. Helena where the building was undergoing an adaptive reuse. It was a home of a beloved doctor in St. Helena who passed away at the age, I believe, was 100. It was purchased, was being adaptively reused as an office, and it was not on any official register. And they wanted to use the code because of the change in use, they had to make the building accessible. And they had to make the primary entrance accessible. And you're looking at the primary entrance. It was a little wall enclosed little courtyard, a few steps, then went up a couple more steps, and then one more step up into the building. It was on Main Street. So to make this conform, put in an accessible entrance as would have been required under the California Building Code, it would have meant destroying that. So the owner had to document that this was an important feature of the building, but their first step was to get it officially recognized. So they went through the steps to nominate this building or put it on the city council's agenda, got it officially recognized, did the proper paperwork, and then we used the code. But this was something where they came in and they sat down, they said, we want to make this work, what's it going to take? So what they ended up doing, using the code, using some of the alternatives, was providing signage, directional signage at the front of the building, and directing people to the accessible entrance that was on the side of the building. It was less than 200 feet away. St. Helena Depot, National Register listed property, was an extreme case of disrepair, purchase for use for offices. And we had an issue regarding proximity to property lines with this building. The railroad tracks were on a separate parcel. The property line went right up to the edge of the building. The building had eaves that projected over the property line. It had a number of openings on the property line. And if we were to apply the California Building Code, the regular code, it would have meant lopping off the overhang, closing in the openings, putting in a firewall. And the argument was made, well, this is a railroad track, isn't it public? It is not public. It was private property. And we spoke with our city attorney who said, you can't use this as a public right-of-way. You cannot consider it a public right-of-way because that railroad track could be abandoned and someone could build a building there and then we have a problem. So what we ended up doing was we ended up using the California Historical Building Code to use the alternatives for the treatment of exterior walls to protect openings. We used fire sprinklers. So these are just some close-ups of the walls that were in question, baggage rooms that had large openings. The building inside had been torched by homeless people, kids, you name it, to some shots in construction. But what they ended up doing was, and it's very hard to see, but under that eave line, they ran a sprinkler line that provided sprinklers. The buildings were fully sprinkled, by the way. So they had an exterior sprinkler line that ran along the perimeter of that wall. Every opening had protection, and those walls were protected. And that was an alternative that was allowed under the California Historical Building Code that preserved that building and protected the character of that building. This was also a tax credit project. This is a building, again, in St. Helena. This was, I think, one of the most interesting projects that I had worked on, and it was interesting because I think the owners took the right step before they even purchased the building. They came in and sat down and told us what they wanted to do, and then we wanted to find a way to make this work. This building, its historic name is Amir Hotel. It's a contributor in our National Register district, and it had been a restaurant on the first floor and a residence on the second floor. It is essentially landlocked. Property lines run along 3 sides of the building. And the front of the building, the primary entrance was right there when it was a restaurant on the ground floor. So there were steps up into that building. And there was really no way that we could make that entrance accessible and still protect the integrity of this building because it was on the National Register. But what they did have over here was a 5-foot side yard, but that still wasn't enough to give them to provide access and not protect those openings because this was required firewalls, parapets because of its proximity to the property line, which is the fence. What we ended up doing and what they documented was that the building next door had a driveway that went there. You can see the driveway entrance there. But there was a utility easement, PG&E, phone easement. There are a number of easements that went right through that driveway. And we said the likelihood that that will ever be developed is very, very slim because of the presence of those easements. And the likelihood that this property owner would ever be allowed to build out there, the adjacent property, is also very, very slim. So we got the information, we did the research, we documented it, and that allowed us to move forward with the alternatives. So the alternatives were, like the other property, was they put sprinklers under the eave, they put sprinklers over the opening, and they provided a fully compliant, accessible entrance to the restaurant on this side that went back into a courtyard, and they got into the building. One of the other interesting points of this building was that because they had changed the use of the second floor now to a restaurant, we got into some of the nuancing of the accessibility code. And they ended up providing an elevator to the second floor. And the reason that they did that, they argued that, well, we have restaurants sitting down here. They had a very different functional use up here. And I felt, as a building official, that it triggered compliance or accessibility. And they put in an elevator and provided full access up here. And when we talked about this in the beginning, we were looking at every possible option. We sat down and they were talking about catwalks and going across the roof of adjacent buildings to get people off that second floor. And we said, it just isn't going to work. Let's do it the right way. And so they came up with a very successful project that allowed for access and protected the building. Cornerstone Building, another building in St. Helena where you had, it was a former hotel. On the ground floor, there is now retail use. On the second floor, it was converted to offices, and there was only one entrance to the second floor. Regular code would require 2 because of the occupant load and the use. So what the applicant proposed was a fire access there. And then the inside, a window that at the time that this code was applied, I believe the code has since changed, This was compliant. The opening was specified, met the code requirements. They signed it properly for exiting, and then they had the exit ladder that came down into a parking lot. The other interesting thing about this was because they had provided the stairway, the owner was complaining that kids in the neighborhood were going out partying at night and going up the stairs onto the roof and were throwing beer bottles down onto the streets below, garbage, and he had a real hazard on his hand. So he wanted to get rid of this. And I said, you can't do that. I said, but what you can do is block access to the roof. So he ended up putting a hinged, unlockable metal gate right here that was accessible only to qualified people, service people. So it satisfied both needs, retained the exiting as designed. This is an interesting case about documentation and kind of extreme makeover. This is a house in Napa. This is in the early 90s. It's owned by a friend, Juliana Im is an architect in Napa, vice mayor of Napa. Give her a plug. This house had been converted to duplexes and had obviously suffered over the years with some insensitive alteration. And she wanted to restore it. So she did her homework. She went and found in the archives of the Historical Society original drawings and the original plans of the building that showed what it looked like. There's there. She had floor plans, everything. She found historic photographs. And then when they began to strip the plaster off that porch, they found the paint shadows and that showed the configuration of the handrail. And then there are elements of the existing rail that were still intact when they pulled that plaster off. So this was all submitted to us as a documentation and proof, allowing the handrail to be reconstructed as it was originally designed. Now, someone earlier had asked, well, about the question about handrails and when do you change them and when do you, what do you do? In a situation like this where it's a single family residence, this was fine because these are people that live there. They're familiar with it. They know the conditions. If this was something else, if this was a restaurant or more intensive use, then we might look at maybe some other measures you can do to provide protection. But what happened here was they took what was a very nondescript, damaged house and restored it back to a single family dwelling and restored the character defining features. I'm getting all messed up here. Meow. Come on, City. There we go. Anyway, so they, they did it. And it's a lovely addition to the First Street in Napa. And it was allowed and achieved through use of the code. Similar situation where when I was on the commission for the city of Napa after I left, this house came in where the owner wanted to restore the front porch, and similar thing with handrails, guardrails. They wanted to restore the original, and all they had, I remember this because I was on the commission, they had a little black and white photograph, a snapshot taken in the 50s of a couple kids in a wading pool in the front yard, but it was the only thing they had that showed what that porch looked like. So they went about to reconstruct it using that photographic evidence. They had to get a variance to allow the front stairs to project into the front yard, which the commission and the planning commission gave them. There was a process. It wasn't automatic, but they were allowed to do it, again, using the code. So they redid it and as it was historically, but it was by giving us that photograph. It was the only thing that they had. That was something that we could hang our hat on. You need to give us a handle. And another interesting case, this was a bed and breakfast in Napa called Cedar Gables. They were applying to convert the home designed by Ernest Coxhead, very historic home, contributed to a National Register district. Wanted to convert it to a bed and breakfast. It had a very small backyard, very, very narrow. The only real yard it had was on the side and out front, and they had to meet a minimum parking requirement for the city regulations. And the architect, who happened to be Julie Inman, same one as that, the house with the guardrail, came in with a plan to use the semicircular driveway and street parking to fulfill the parking requirement. They also used these turf blocks over here. So it gave the appearance of being a landscaped area. The owners did not want to pave over that front yard to put in parking. It would have affected the character of that building. Very prominent building in Napa. So it's through the use of the code that they were allowed to do that. One of the other important features of this building were these cedar trees out front. So if they had to pave that over, it would have absolutely impacted those trees, the landscaping. By the way, the code does have alternatives for site treatment. These are just some of the examples, again, minor things, the way the code is used. But as I said, every one of these involved a conversation. I was a project inspector on the Culinary Institute when it was converted from Greystone to the Culinary Institute in 1995. And they had, we used the code for construction rating purposes. The building was completely fire sprinklered. And because it was fire sprinklered, it was not required to have 1 hour or fire rated construction throughout, which was very important because some of the character defining features in this building were the stone walls, the heavy timbers, the wood floors. There was a lot going on in here that they wanted to protect. It did not, it is important to note that the code does not waive the number of exits. So they still had to meet the minimum requirements for the number of exits. But we were use those provisions of the code to allow for non-fire rated walls to protect finishing. This is the kitchen on the 3rd floor of the Culinary Institute, and the code was applied in a very unique, very small application, but it was important. It happened at the back of the building. Again, it's a stone masonry building, and those stone walls are character defining. This was a winery and a winery storage area. And the health department required that those walls be covered with a smooth, washable, impervious surface, light colored surface that's required in the food facilities law. And we ended up with the health inspector and the culinary team there, their designers, accepting an application of glass to protect, to really kind of achieve the same thing. Smooth, impervious, not necessarily light covered, but they use that in a very narrow application. But this is just one instance where the code was applied successfully, as it would have been a shame to cover the wall up. This is just kind of illustrates, I think, one of the issues that we have in looking at historic buildings and accessibility. This was a building, again, on the Culinary Institute property where they wanted to reuse the building, and they since have reused the building since I took this photo. But when I left the city, we were in negotiations about this and how do we treat this entrance. This is put in a ramp here would affect the character of the building, would affect the landscaping. This is a National Register site. So, we were in consultation talking about just how to treat that. But one of the things the code did allow was to put an accessible entrance within 200 feet if it was properly signed. And I think it's important to note that in all of the applications of the code, the accessibility provisions are the ones where I think most building officials will take a very hard line, and I think that it is justified. In fact, I believe the code requires that your first charge is to comply with the regular provisions of the code, and if that's going to damage the character, the fabric, the integrity of the building, you start looking at the alternatives. But if you can make it work, using the regular code, you do that. I mean, why wouldn't you? But if it's going to affect the character, destroy the integrity, then the code has a path for compliance. And so in this case, we were talking about making the side entrance accessible with the proper signage. And so at that point, I left the city, and it wasn't mine to deal with anymore. But these were just some of the let's say, kind of projects where there was an approach or an attitude of kind of working together as a team to find a successful resolution to an issue. And many of the things that a building official will deal with are kind of on the smaller scale. You do have some of those grand projects. You do have in my case, the Krugs, the Behringers, the culinary institutes that come into town. But by and large, it was the smaller projects. And I think in the aggregate, these are the things that really are worth preserving because they provide the identity and the character of a community. So that is the spirit in which I approached it. And to the question earlier about building officials and their training, the California Building Officials Training Institute offers courses to building departments every year on the historical building code. It's part of their education week. It's part of their annual business meeting. They do workshops on it. I participated in that for years. So they have made a real effort to train people about how to use the code. Dan Chudy would teach these classes in the South, and I would be doing it in the North when we had our education weeks. So I think there's been a real effort to do that, but it is very important, and I can't underscore this enough, that in applying the code, it is the applicant that must ask it, and it is incumbent on the applicant to provide the documentation and the information to justify how you're going to use these alternatives. So with that, I'll end it if you have any questions.
On the railroad project where the overhang intrude onto the neighbor's property, did the owner record a prescriptive easement so that the railroad owner can't tell him?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, I left that out. Yes, they did.
Good. Yeah. And are people familiar with prescriptive easements, I guess, for protection? Maybe you can answer that. People are people familiar with prescriptive easements for protecting overhang?
Well, what they ended up doing was putting a 5-foot easement along that wall, so to ensure that nothing could be built closer than that. But that is what they did on that property in that case.
Well, Cindy, regarding the hotel that was converted to offices, offhand, I don't know if the office use has a higher occupancy load than the original hotel use. Do you know it doesn't?
I think the office use is higher. Trying to, Alan, you're asking questions.
Yeah, well, no,
I think that it was, and in all honesty, that was done just before I came to the city.
Yeah.
But I think that in that change in use, they recognized and probably came to a consensus there that something needed to be done, again, because the code doesn't relieve you with the number of exits.
Well, interesting. So, interesting question though. If it had remained as a hotel use, would not have required a second.
Would not have required it, and I believe what the code requires is that when you have more than 10 on the second floor, you had to provide a second exit.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
in both cases.
Yeah, and I think what had happened with that is it was a hotel in its historic use, and it probably had been used as offices, and the new owner came in and upgraded it and got tagged at that time, said you have to put in an exit. But had it remained in its original use, they wouldn't have had to change it.
Okay, so as a building official, I think I know the answer, but would you ever accept or entertain the argument that, for instance, in this case, because it's going from a residential use where there are people there at night asleep, and unfamiliar with the building, going to an office use, which is only used in the daytime, and with people are more familiar with the building, you're actually going to less dangerous occupancy, and maybe the existing single egress would be allowable.
Absolutely. Again, this is getting into the intent, understanding the nature of the hazard that's being presented by the use. And clearly, I think a transient occupancy use like a hotel has a higher level of risk, because you do have people that aren't familiar with the building, aren't familiar with the exits and the conditions. So yeah, that argument could certainly have been made, and I think it would be a valid argument. But if no one's going to challenge that, that's what you're going to get. Yeah.
Thank you, Cindy. My question is regarding when you're unable to use the main entrance because of it would ruin the character-defining features or whatnot. You have the 200 feet, the signage, but what other considerations do you need to take into account for where that puts you in the building? For example, if the only other usable entrance you have is in the kitchen. So that's one part of the question. What do you need to do to make that work as an entrance? And the second part is with regard to the parking. What distance, say the parking is in the front, the disabled parking, and you're going 200 feet around the building. I mean, is there a limit on that as well?
I've been out of this for 13 years. So it's, yeah, I haven't done this in a while, Nancy. You know, what I can tell you is that when we would be faced with something like this, is that we would just look at all the alternatives. And as far as I was concerned, with accessibility requirements, you had to make a really strong case to look at alternatives. You had to make a really, really strong case. In this particular case, I believe that there was space for parking in the back of the building because it was a driveway on two sides. You came in, you swept around, and I believe that there was space on the back for parking. You know, a lot of it, I think, depends on what the use is, what the configuration is. These things are taken on a case-by-case, item-by-item basis. I believe that that is exactly the language in the code. So every one is unique, and you have to look at each one separately. So what you do over here, you may not be able to do over there. So they're all different. But we take generally, I think, in particular with accessibility, a firmer stand. And I think that the code directs you to do that, because your first charge is to comply with the regular code, and then you move into the alternatives.
Yeah. And Nancy, just the code language itself, the first recommendation, if you can't get into the main entrance, is a secondary entrance used by the general public. So if you can possibly manage to do that, that is your first alternative. The second alternative is, I mean, you know, is one that's not used by the general public, and a monitored one, and so forth, but it's not the first option. The issue regarding disabled access location, that you're going to have to go to regular code for that. I don't think there are any absolute limitations on how far away a disabled accessible parking space can be from the entrance. But certainly, if, as a part of a comprehensive ADA compliance, you're going to want to locate the parking place as close as you can to the accessible location entrance, not to the main entrance. You know, so. But
you spoke about the staircase that projected into the front yard, and I'm just wondering, that's a zoning issue, not a building code issue. does the historic building code address those kinds of things, or is that a jurisdictional decision?
Well, I believe it does because it applies to citing. Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it does. In this case, they were going through, they had to go through a process through the Cultural Heritage Commission. It was a discretionary process, so they ended up getting a variance. If they had challenged it and said, we don't think we need a variance to reestablish this, I think they may be on good ground to make that assertion. But they ended up going through it anyway, because they were restoring it the way it was. It was a residential neighborhood. There was nothing really had changed about that except that 30 years prior, someone lopped off the stairs. They were not compelled to do that.
Yeah, the code is not very clear on it. Chapter 10 is the code to go to, the section to go to. And the reason it's not very clear is because every time we tried to clarify it, we ran into issues with the fact that zoning jurisdiction and our statute doesn't help us very much. So in cases like the ones that Freeman Attorney and some other cases with our time today, it has to be cited as, essentially all it says is the historic importance of the building extends to its site. And so then you have to figure out, how do you develop alternatives that meet the requirements of the, but remember, it doesn't have the same kind of leverage as it does as a building code when the time goes on.
Yeah, there is.
And so, we have decided not to try to change it because it is a hook, and anything further that we tried to write, we would be running into trouble with jurisdiction.
Also, on scale items, and I guess I can really only ask what you would have done when you were the building official. That's what the example was. You build that's not what we can expect from others. But you said, oh, well, all the photograph documentation they had was this criminal snapshot from 1950s. Well, that's about 1 million times more than most houses have.
Yes.
And maybe you were working in a smaller city with fewer things to have been photographed and slower turnover of ownership. But in the absence of that arbitrary and accidental stroke of good fortune, what about prevailing fluid practices? I mean, obviously that fancy super-duper design you wouldn't be able to substantiate, but looking at similar houses and what would it take to have convinced you, and what would you recommend for other building officials elsewhere that 1890 house wouldn't have 40-inch porch buildings that way?
Yeah. Well, what would I do? What I would do is I would, ask the owner or take the initiative to look at what's in the neighborhood, look what's around. And again, think about as a building official, I would think about what is the risk, what is the exposure, who is going to be using this, what is the hazard in putting in a lower handrail. I could make a case for a higher guardrail, for instance, in certain applications. Certainly, you would want a compliant handrail in certain applications. It's a single-family home, not transient. I would begin to look at the alternatives and would need some documentation to show us. Again, if I'm going to ask to make an exception to the code, I want something in the file that gives me the backup, that shows that there was thought and there was a process and logic to this decision. I'm thinking of some cases where we did allow, I think in my experience, the handrail guardrail in single-family homes was probably the most common application of the code that I've had. You know, would we allow that if it was a bed and breakfast? Well, you could reconstruct the handrail as it was, but maybe you add a compliant one on the inside with the right diameter and the right return, proper height, what, you know. So I think that there are ways that you can do that and still meet the intent of the code, provide a reasonable level of safety and protect the building. You know, I think that, you know, absent documentation, take a look at what's out there. Take a look at what was typical for the period. You know, but I think I would ask the owner to do that because that's what the building official can do. They can ask you to provide that documentation. So do it. You know.
My question is, have there been any legal challenges to the application of the historic building code? Just as a hypothetical example, if there was a trip and fall accident and a high-powered attorney is on the case, have you had any experience with how the code holds up?
You know, I've never had that experience directly. I can't think of an instance in anything that I looked at, you know, that was the case. I really don't know.
I can answer that. I've done a couple of testimony in district court for federal and California. When you're getting a tripping hazard and you're also combining your claims with ADA, you're talking huge damages, huge. So, and most attorneys will cite those as separate. So one could be flagrant neglect of maintaining the site. So it has nothing to do with accessibility. And then the other one will be for accessibility. So they can claim physical damages and all that on the trip and fall on that hurts your body.
California Historic Building Code does not allow that. So it's not following, that's not following CHBC. The CHBC doesn't have allow tripping hazards and make allowance for that.
Yep.
Can you repeat?
What Alan said was the state historic building code does not allow for those sorts of conditions under the application of the alternative provisions of the code, even for accessibility. So, I mean, you have to comply. It doesn't tolerate a lesser level of safety. So, I mean, it's not, you know, again, these things are taken on a case-by-case basis. So, you know, I can tell you in my experience, I've not had any lawsuits. That doesn't mean that none have prevailed, but you know.
What we're going to do now is break for lunch. A few quick announcements. As our schedule originally had us leaving for lunch at 11:45, we're not running too late. It's around 11:55, I think, right now. So we're going to reconvene here at 1:15 for the session on the accessibility chapter of the CHBC, which Alan will be presenting. So please arrive here on time at 1:15. I'm going to give you a few options for lunch here. There's one place right across the driveway here. It's called Cafe Rio, California. There's a place on 14th and Clay also, and it's called Lunch Stop Cafe. And then finally Cafe 15, which is on Jefferson and 15th. There's plenty of other options around. Encourage you to walk. It looks like the rain has stopped.